Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this event. I'm Richard Burgon, the Secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs. And at the start of the COVID crisis, we heard lots of talk, didn't we, about building a better society out of this pandemic. Sadly, as we've seen over the last 2 years, that hasn't been the case. It's led to more inequality, more poverty, and more suffering. We know that change will only come if we're organised and if we fight for it. So that means raising clear demands and building the movements that campaign for that change. So throughout 2022, the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs is organising a series of online policy seminars in partnership with the Labour Assembly Against Austerity and Momentum, looking at the key policies we need to be raising in our movements and in wider society. So tonight, we're kicking off with this session on climate change after COP26, the fight for a socialist Green New Deal. There's no end to the topics that we could have started with and that we will be discussing in our monthly seminars over the coming months. But we wanted to start with climate change as it's the greatest issue facing humanity, and it must be a priority for everyone on the left. Not only will climate change make every other problem that we face in society much worse, it will bring its own enormous challenges. We won't be able to tackle the other problems we face of poverty, inequality, falling quality of life and hunger unless we tackle climate change. So tackling climate change must be at the core of everything that we do. Now, it goes without saying that free market capitalism has brought us to this cliff edge. It's its greatest ever free market failure. And we can't solve this problem with more free market capitalism. Climate change is a class issue. The 1% and their disproportionate consumption brought us here, but those least responsible are the hardest hit all over the globe. We can't leave solutions to this crisis in the hands of the political class representing that 1%. We need solutions rooted in the lives of the 99%, rooted in public ownership, in state intervention, regulation, and global cooperation, and based on justice. And our fantastic speakers tonight will look at the solutions that we need to be fighting for. And it gives me great pleasure to run through the speakers that we've got with us tonight. We've got Asad, Rehman, Director of War on Want and co-founder of the COP26 Coalition of Climate Campaigners. Assad has been one of the leading global activists in the climate justice movement. We've got Rebecca Long-Bailey MP, Labour's Shadow Energy Secretary under Jeremy Corbyn, who's done so much in the Labour movement to map out the transformative policies that can both tackle climate change and level up our country. We've got Chris Saltmarsh, co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal and author of Burnt, Fighting for Climate Justice. We've got Nadia Whittome on her climate education bill. Nadia, of course, is the Member of Parliament for Nottingham South. I always get mixed up. Nottingham East. And sometimes I feel tempted to introduce Nadia by saying she's far better than her predecessor as the MP for Nottingham East, but that would be damning her with faint praise because that was Christopher Leslie. So not only is Nadia better than the predecessor, she's a fantastic MP, one of the best MPs in Parliament. We're also going to hear from Gaia, the chair of Momentum, one of our partnering organisations, who will look at a new Momentum climate justice programme. So please do put your questions in the chat and we'll use them after our speakers. And so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, Asad.
Thank you, Richard, and solidarity to everybody for joining us this evening. So going into the climate summit in November, If you remember, the world was reeling from a summer of devastating climate impacts, fires, floods, droughts in literally every corner of the world. And it was bringing home the urgency of the climate crisis to many, way beyond what was seen as the traditional climate movement. That, alongside the publication of the IPCC, the World Climate Scientists Working Group 1 on climate science, which set out that the impacts were happening much faster than predicted, they were much more severe than the models had predicted. And we saw climate scientists taking to the airwaves, ringing the alarm bells and saying we are standing on the edge of the precipice, the very future of humanity hangs in the balance. And once again, reiterating the importance of limiting temperature levels to well below 1.5 degrees and reminding us again of the carbon budget, and that even for a 2 in 3 chance of preventing that breach, that we would likely pass that by 2030, and the even more dangerous 22 degrees C target was at risk, possibly even by 2040 or just beyond. Yet global emissions were rising at their highest level on record, and that the current actions of all governments would only deliver a temperature level increase of above 3 degrees. Yet, despite this renewed public attention, significant media focus, warning by climate scientists, a broader movement from climate justice that had gone beyond the traditional environmentalists, at least on paper, it seemed that we had the perfect combination for action. And if we remember back, even our own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said on the opening of the climate talks, we're at 1 minute to midnight, and promised this would be the COP that delivered on the 1.5 degree goal, where rich countries would meet their financial pledge made in 2009 for the 100 billion, and that those already facing the huge impacts would be given the support they needed. Then, of course, he fell asleep in the plenary before catching a private jet back to London. His main goal met: a glitzy platform to rub shoulders with world leaders as part of the rebrand of global Britain, or as his ministers more accurately said, Empire 2.0. So as we all know, the COP failed both people and planet. It ended with rich countries refusing to do their fair share of effort, pushing the need to act on those least responsible for the crisis, temperature levels set for at least 2.7 degree warming, with frankly unimaginable consequences. And that, of course, is if all the pledges are met. And we've had lots of warm words about the need to act, but I'm sure other speakers will undoubtedly touch on the UK's own weak and unjust target, lack even the concrete policies and plans to deliver the deadly and unfair 2050 goal. So the outcome, noted with regret, that rich countries wouldn't meet the 100 billion, even of course, whilst they were finding something close to 16 trillion to respond to the COVID pandemic. Much of that, of course, was in handouts to big business. And all during the COP, the UK government provided platform after platform for big businesses like Amazon and for bankers such as Mark Carney to talk about how the private sector would deliver where governments were unable. Mark Carney was at least honest enough to admit that the trillions in climate finance that they were magically promising were all about maximising the opportunity for the private sector to profit from, whether it's from the offsets and carbon markets at net zero, and not about tackling the climate crisis, energy poverty, inequality, or ensuring that everyone had the right to live with dignity. We could say that the main outcome of the COP was the successful capture of climate policy by the net zero logic to maintain our current economic system. So rather than act, they were going to rely on, of course, unproven techno fixes that simply allow big business to continue to pollute. Justice and equity were sidelined, and corporate elites who were already busy sacrificing people and planet for profit were now being hailed as the saviors. Even the 100 billion finance goal, which is, of course, a drop in the ocean compared to the trillions that are needed for a real justice transition, will continue to be unmet, and rich countries led by the US but backed by the UK and EU have all made categorically clear that they refuse to take any responsibility or accept any liability for the impacts already being felt, and of course those in the future as we spiral out of control. So the question we of course all ask ourselves is, so why did it fail? You could put it simply in saying, well, on the one hand, imperialism and racialized capitalism, and on the other, the question of power. So we all know that the logic of the past is as present today as when the global north was putting people in chains and sending gunboats to eviscerate people and their economies. this idea of sacrificing of people and exploitation of resources, which has always been central to the accumulation of capital and our unequal and unjust economic system of growth, that connects, of course, the doctrine of discovery to today's neoliberal economic system. And at its core, we all know, is that the lives of the poorest, Black, brown, Indigenous people are expendable. And you may have seen the article and the book by Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, who recently said, 2 centuries of European colonialists tour around the world, viewing nature and land as something inert to be conquered and consumed without limit. Indigenous people as savages whose knowledge of nature was worthless and who needed to be erased. And it was this settler colonial worldview of just accumulate, consume that has got us to where we are now. Now, when we talk about, secondly, this question of power, and I'm trying to be very brief on the time that I've got, we know that our multilateral system is anything but multilateral. We know it continues to be shaped, dominated, delivers for the economic interests of the most powerful, of corporations, of the richest country, and of course the billionaire elites. And if you haven't seen today's research on global inequality and how the billionaire class have doubled their wealth, even as the poorest in the world have seen their wealth decrease during the COVID pandemic, we know that, of course, it's propping up a bankrupt neoliberal economic system, which is enriching the 1%, as Richard said. And it's not just the COP, it's true across the WTO, the IMF, World Bank, the response to COVID, tackling global inequality, SDGs, etc. And we saw it clearly at play during the COP. But secondly, I think importantly for us as people of the movement, we have to also talk about the power of our movement. So undoubtedly, we've undergone a profound shift in recent years, right? The decades of when I remember of when justice, equity, racism, inequality, as well as the agency and demands of the movements of the global South, were being deliberately marginalized and actively opposed by mainstream environmentalism because it threatened their dominant framework and theory of change that saw climate only through the lens of carbon reductions and relegated questions of power and the economic system, because for them, their primary focus was always on insider advocacy to tweak policies that would not challenge the economic status quo. And, our collective work has clearly laid the groundwork for a profound shift, but that hasn't yet resulted in a movement that has sufficient power, the vision of political demands, or realize yet our strategy of building a movement to seriously challenge the dominant economic and political model of racialized capitalism. And so, yes, there is increasingly, we are seeing more and more of mainstream groups, environmentalists and corporations and governments now using or adopting and often co-opting, of course, the term climate justice. And we know that this has largely been superficial, and it mainly, even at its best, talks only about the disproportionate unequal effects of the crisis on the global South and, of course, on working people and communities of colour in the global South. But it says very little about the structural causes of the climate crisis, beyond saying, well, it's the fossil fuel industry. And it does nothing to talk about how that was created or amplifies the inequalities and injustices that fuel this climate crisis. And the solutions that are put forward continue to promote or assume that anything to do on climate will result in climate justice outcomes, ignoring that, of course, that many of these solutions that are being purported replicate the same extractivist model that reinforces and creates many of the climate injustices. And the pathways that are proposed that do at least recognize that economic well-being and racial inequality are central to the fight against climate crisis are often, of course, we know, underdeveloped. They don't necessarily lack complete coherence, and yet to respond either both to the ambition, urgency, or fair share of action that is needed. And where we do have radical solutions, often they're limited, of course, only to the borders of rich countries. So we know that we have done a huge amount of work collectively to start to thread together this fragmented climate movement that was mainly focusing on individual site battles and move it to this approach of movement, of building collective power. Yet I think we've got still a long way to go to really rally around what I would call an anti-imperialist internationalism. So, of course, we need to articulate the global dimension of the crisis. And yes, it's really useful to see more and more of our movement using slogans like system change, not climate change, or uprooting the system. But without clear political analysis and real concrete policy demands to underpin that genuine movement and that vision, we could see ourselves replicating the same policy focus as mainstream environmentalism, that this is merely simply about a focus on transforming our electricity, or it's about cars, or it's simply about fossil fuel giants, rather than what we need, which is a transformative economic vision that undoes the centuries of racialized capitalism with a real vision of internationalism, solidarity, and cooperation. I was asked to say something about what our movements are calling for now in the global south. So yes, of course, they want us to continue to fight around things like around loss and damage and climate reparations, on energy justice. They want us to, of course, focus our fights around our own government's policies, whether it's on trade and tax and on corporations. And of course, they want us to stop the blame game that makes countries of the global south the villains, while the richest and most powerful countries in the world claim they are climate champions. But most importantly, what they want us to do is they actually want a genuine internationalist movement in the UK, one that has got the political education, one that is committed to movement building, and is going beyond simply talking about the climate crisis to making real concrete demands that food, water, and energy are public goods, democratically controlled and shared equitably within planetary limits, where demands around living wages and social protection and universal public services are for all citizens and not just citizens in the global north, for land rights and the right to move and not to move to become a part and parcel of our discourse on the climate crisis, for wealth not just to be taxed, but to be redistributed, and for control of our economic system to be wrestled away from the hands of the corporate elite and put back into the hands of people. What they're really calling on us in movements in the global north is for us to rediscover our internationalism, to remember our radicalism, and not only call for an end to the climate crisis, but fundamentally to racialized capitalism, unsustainable growth. And they want us to rebuild that movement that was, started here in the UK, one that's had as its clarion call that workers of the world need to unite, and that the world that we want to create is the world that we're fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asad. That was really informative and thought-provoking. And I think it really is an important call that as a movement we rediscover our internationalism in order to deal with running an effective campaign for climate justice. I think it's vital that we rediscover as a movement our internationalist roots. So thank you so much. And it gives me great pleasure to move on to our next speaker, who is, who needs no introduction, the fantastic Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for asking me to speak with so many great speakers tonight. Now, we've all heard of Naomi Klein, and she wrote a groundbreaking paper back in 2011 called Capitalism versus the Climate, where she said that real climate solutions are ones that steer interventions to systematically disperse and devolve power and control to the community level. And importantly, arriving at these new systems is going to require shedding the free market ideology that has dominated the global economy for more than 3 decades. Well, 11 years on, we've still not tackled climate change, and now we're in the midst of a cost of living catastrophe, which is only set to get worse. And on top of all of this, annual fuel bills are expected to rise by a whopping 50% to £2,000 per year when the current energy price cap comes into play in April, when it's raised. And sadly, what hasn't been talked about in the mainstream media in recent weeks is that the only policy model that will truly address these crises, the climate crises and the cost of living crises properly, is a Green New Deal. Now, that might sound very abstract to everyone who's listening tonight, but I'll try to explain why. Now, when we look at the energy crisis, it's right to call for emergency temporary relief on bills. For example, the government must cut the rate of VAT of household energy bills as soon as possible. They must expand and increase the warm homes discount. They've got to make sure that the cost of supplier failure doesn't go onto household bills, and they must increase universal credit to offset soaring inflation, as well as increasing public sector pay and the living wage. But as we all know, these are all just sticking plasters. There are much longer term problems that have been bubbling away for years. One of them is closing down the UK's largest gas storage plant in 2017 without a plan to replace it. That was absolutely bonkers. And the government was repeatedly warned about that at the time, that we were going to have more volatile winters and that prices were going to be affected as a result, but they didn't listen. But perhaps one of the most acute issues is the business model of the energy sector as a whole. Now, for years since privatisation, the monopoly grid companies have prioritised dividend extraction over upgrading the system for renewable energy. For example, National Grid paid shareholders 1.4 billion in both 2020 and 2021, and they paid a record 3.2 billion in 2017. That was money that could have gone back into the grid to upgrade it and make it ready for renewable energy. Added to that is the fact that a lot of the electricity generators didn't really start investing in renewables until public subsidies were put on the table. And the supply market, as we all know, it's in complete disarray. And now we're in a situation where smaller suppliers are folding, which creates even less competition in the market. And I use competition quite kind of vaguely there, because I don't really think there was a lot of competition in the energy market, given that most people didn't tend to switch, and even the government realised that when they eventually brought in a price cap. But in response to those suppliers folding, the government is setting aside billions to prop up firms that are too big to fail. But with that public money is coming no public stake in return, no obligations to move towards renewable energy, no change in the broken market, no reduction in household bills, and none of the benefits of public ownership. And the sad reality is that if our energy system was brought into public ownership, public companies wouldn't be duty bound to prioritise huge returns for shareholders. They could actually invest in the energy system, invest in renewables, and use the financially buoyant times to build up reserves to protect against the kind of price fluctuations that we're seeing at the moment. And these companies would be transparent, they'd be democratically accountable to the needs of consumers, not driven by a director duty to prioritise shareholder return above all else. And it's not as if this is pie in the sky. They understand this in Germany. 2/3 of electricity is bought from municipally owned energy companies. They understand it in France as well. 2/3 buy their electricity from EDF, who's majority owned by the French state, which also, by the way, runs the grids and generates most of the electricity in France. And they actually supply and generate electricity here in the UK. But absurdly, even though we've got companies here in the UK that are owned partially by the French state, we don't have any publicly owned companies here in the UK that could generate a return to the people of the United Kingdom. Now, public ownership also points towards cheaper bills. There's a huge amount of academic research that has shown that it does point towards that drop in prices. For households, there was a study in 2013 by the Department of Economics, Management and Quantitative Method at the University of Milan that found when you compare electricity costs across the whole of Europe, public ownership is associated with prices that are 20 to 30% lower than private ownership. And in the UK, we've had recent research done by David Hall and Vera Wegman at the University of Greenwich that showed that eliminating private energy ownership would be equivalent to a staggering 25% reduction in energy prices. So it's clear that in addressing the energy crisis, public ownership has to be central. It's central to cheaper bills. And the key issue in relation to climate change is that without public ownership, we actually can't decarbonise at the scale and pace needed to tackle climate change, period. It's as simple as that. Now, that's just something that's been in the news that I wanted to have a bit of a rant about, because I was a bit upset that we weren't hearing enough of the arguments around public ownership being talked about in response to the current energy crisis. But of course, that public ownership, it's just one part of the Green New Deal that we must all fight for. It's worth remembering that the Green New Deal, it wasn't just a vehicle to tackle climate change and ensure the health of future generations. It's also the biggest economic lever we've ever had to implement the radical economic change needed to tackle social injustice and inequality. Now, as you know, in the last general election, we had in our Labour manifesto a bold and ambitious programme called the Green Industrial Revolution, and it focused on a whole range of industrial measures such as decarbonising energy and transport, home retrofitting, publicly owned energy and water, decarbonising energy-intensive industries, providing a just transition for affected workers, as well as unionised, well-paid workforces and much, much more. And that's all great. It's great. We need to keep all of that. But what we now need to do is move our policy goals beyond energy and industry. And in my view, the next step has to be social care. What we need to be calling for now is a green public national care service, just like the NHS. And that means recognising that care jobs are green jobs and they should be paid as such, and that investing in care, in its green physical infrastructure and green care technologies is investing in a sustainable future. I think that government research spending, for example, should be allocated to brilliant emerging cutting edge technologies that monitor or assist those receiving care. And we could make sure that those technologies come with a green kite mark to evidence that they're produced and function in a sustainable way. Further to that, through targeted investment, homes and care homes could be transformed by retrofitting them to the highest energy efficient standards, reducing their bills and eliminating fuel poverty. And we could also roll out technologies like heat pumps, solar hot water and the like, so that the homes and care homes can generate their own energy. And then we can think bigger than that. For those who want to downsize, to move closer to family, and I know it's something that my parents are thinking about at the moment, and can they get a bungalow for love and money? No, they can't. When we have people that want to move closer to their family or be in a place where they feel safer and have closer access to care, we couldn't just pledge to build more suitable green council homes. We could examine new housing models such as co-housing, common ground trusts, as well as creating public development corporations to buy land and build specific new green care and retirement villages that not only provide green high quality homes and green space, but reduce travel for carers themselves so that everybody receives the immediate care and support that they need. And of course, for workers in the care sector, some of the lowest paid workers in the country, by delivering fair and unionised work with good pay, terms and conditions that recognises the pivotal role that care workers are going to play in our Green New Deal and within our society, we can address staff shortages as well as training and retaining experienced staff. Now, they're just a few ideas of what we can do here in the UK and how exciting and far-reaching our Labour policies can become. And frankly, if governments across the world are serious about tackling climate change, and COP26 did not demonstrate to me that we had governments across the world that were serious about this, it was quite depressing. They'll actually develop national policy plans and grab the opportunity to reverse decades of deindustrialisation with bold green investment strategies. They'll fast track new industries of the future and support manufacturing bases to develop and manufacture those green technologies. But they won't just do that. They'll tackle social injustice and they'll embrace public and alternative ownership models to distribute wealth fairly. Now, many politicians, the government themselves and commentators won't want to accept any of this because it actually shows that an active state supporting industry and workers within a new democratic economy are actually the only way to comprehensively solve the climate crisis, the cost of living crisis and the social care crisis. So it's up to all of us who are watching this tonight to make sure really that the bold and visionary arguments of the Green New Deal that we hear right across our movement are promoted at every opportunity so that they become mainstream and that our communities truly understand the future that could be possible, that bright future full of hope that will deliver the best quality of life that we possibly can to our community. So get involved, everybody, get organised. And remember, social advance never came from the top. It always comes from below. So we need to make sure that it happens. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Becky, for that explanation of some of the transformative policies that we need to pursue in order to both tackle climate change and truly level up our country. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, who's done such a fantastic job as co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal. And I recommend that everyone reads his book if they haven't done yet, Burnt, Fighting for Climate Justice. Chris Saltmarsh.
Thanks very much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. And thanks very much to everyone for coming, and my solidarity to everyone as well. I'm just going to talk for a little bit, I think, about what we can do as grassroots campaigners. And, I say that because, as Richard said, I think Labour for a Green New Deal has achieved a lot within the party over the past few years. But I really want to stress that we're an entirely voluntary organisation. We're entirely grassroots. And we've been able to really kind of, I think, contribute to shifting the Overton window on a lot of this stuff around climate justice and economic justice, just with effective organisation and really strong ideas. I think on that, one of the things I want to acknowledge is that in just a few years, we've gone from the Green New Deal being this kind of abstract slogan that people don't really know what it means, to something that anyone in the Labour Party and the Labour movement and even the political sphere more widely are really happy to adopt. But I think actually what we see is a real dividing line between people who are serious about a socialist Green New Deal, a transformative Green New Deal, and people who just want to use it as a slogan to rebrand tired old climate policies. So I think for me, there are kind of 4 criteria that we can really hold our elected officials, our politicians, our representatives to, when they're saying they support a Green New Deal. So for me, the first one is pace. Are they calling for rapid decarbonisation? And we heard from Assad earlier about why the UK's 2050 target is so inadequate, so unjust, so unfair. But are we talking about, are we going to rapidly decarbonise within 10 years or sooner, both from a global and domestic justice point of view? The second point is scale. Are we talking about mass public investment in reindustrializing and revitalizing the economy and mobilizing the entire economy towards this dual effort of climate and economic justice? Thirdly, are we talking about public ownership? As Becky was saying, we're talking about nationalizing key industries, including but not limited to energy, so that we can plan a just transition that is as fair and rapid as possible. And fourthly, and equally as importantly, are we talking about internationalism? Are we talking about transferring wealth and resources globally? Are we talking about justice in supply chains? And are we talking about promoting self-determination internationally? For me, a Green New Deal is necessarily a program that will happen at a national level. That's just the nature of how our kind of global politics works. But that doesn't mean that it should not act locally as well as internationally. For me, I don't believe there's such a thing as a local Green New Deal, but because it's such a national thing. But I do believe that as organisers, the work we do is necessarily local in its starting point. I think that over the next few years under this Tory government, what we need to be doing is building the blocks for this programme to be built on. We need to be creating a sense of possibility by winning demands, which we can then illustrate as key components of a Green New Deal that can be scaled up. So for me, one of the real core examples of this is around transport. I think public transport is one of those elements of a Green New Deal that allows us to really clearly demonstrate how we can materially improve people's lives while also rapidly decarbonising. I think it's one of the most visible because that shift, the modal shift from private polluting car use to mass integrated cheap public transport is going to be so obvious as we walk through our streets, and it's going to be so obvious in our daily lives. So I think for me, one of the demands we can be making as local activists is bringing buses and trams into public ownership. We've already heard about why the private model of ownership has failed in so many spheres of the economy. But with a publicly owned public transport system, we could reinstate routes that have been closed down. We could expand new routes. We could reverse cuts to services, bring down skyrocketing fares, and we can give passengers and workers control over the planning of the system. And making public transport accessible in this way, obviously it brings down emissions, but also it allows more people to engage in social life, to access work, education and services. And this is a demand that is eminently possible for metro mayors to deliver. We've already seen in Manchester, I think, Andy Burnham talk about the franchising system he's planning to introduce. Steve Rotherham has been talking about a London-style public transport system for Liverpool. And Lewis Dagnall, who's currently campaigning to be Labour's candidate for South Yorkshire Mayor, is planning full-on public ownership of buses and trams to deliver all of the things that I've outlined. So I think he's setting an example for the Labour left on what we can do to put municipal socialism into practice as part of a Green New Deal. I think another kind of key demand we can be making as local activists, especially in the context of this energy crisis, which Becky described, is making sure that people no longer have to choose between heating and eating. And we need to really make this argument that meeting these basic needs of heating our home, having energy, is linked intimately to the climate crisis, because it's the same energy companies that are profiting from fuel poverty that are also profiting from high emissions. So one of the demands I think we can be making is ensuring that our homes are properly insulated, are energy efficient, in order to bring down bills, but articulating that in the context of a broader political demand of nationalising the energy companies and price caps. So we need to demand of local authorities that council properties are properly maintained and insulated, and also work with tenants unions like Acorn or Living Rent or LRU to take the fight to the private sector. And we can also draw inspiration from groups like Retrofit Gaia in Manchester, which has started a cooperative to promote this work and make it a reality for many people already. And then I think another really core element of demands that we can be making already right now, you know, not having to wait for the election of a socialist government, which I know we're all working for, is around international justice. Assad's already spoken about this, so I won't dwell on it. But I think it's really important for us to understand that the solidarity that we can provide to people and movements around the world struggling for freedom is intimately connected to climate justice. Because if you're Palestine or Cuba or Venezuela or West Papua, if you're living under occupation or blockade by the imperialist US, how can you be expected to use the resources that you have in service of transition, in service of people? And so for me, we need to more and more make that link between anti-imperialism, between anti-occupation and against imperialist blockades and climate justice, because justice is only possible when we see freedom in many of these places. And just in the final few minutes of my contribution, I wanted to talk about what it means to build campaigns locally around these demands and around the principles of the Socialist Green New Deal. For me, I think the first thing is around, as socialists, providing leadership to the wider movement. You know, many of us will be accustomed to and know well the many environmental campaigns that there are locally. It might be Friends of the Earth or Extinction Rebellion or a local climate coalition. Many of these campaigns tend to be single issue or maybe lack the kind of political thrust that we bring to politics. But whether it's through Momentum, Labour for a Green New Deal groups or other local groups, I think as socialists, we need to be working with these groupings to tie them together and provide that broader political ambition. We need to be articulating the politics of a socialist Green New Deal whenever we're campaigning on a local level. I think as well, you know, interventions we can be making as socialists on a local level is supporting local candidates for office, supporting grassroots socialists to be elected, whether that's as a local councillor or a metro mayor or as an MP, because these individuals don't just represent our movement when they enter power, they're a source of power for us all. And when we're talking about making demands around transport or energy or international justice or a Green New Deal more widely, we need to be building power, both in our communities, but also through the formal political process. And so we should be rallying around individuals who are prepared to put themselves forward to represent our movement in these positions. And as I said, I'm really excited by Lewis Dagnall's campaign in South Yorkshire right now. I think is a really good example of inspiring members of the Labour left around a socialist vision in a region and around putting our politics of a Green New Deal into practice. And just the final point I want to make, and to use the cliche, it really is last but not least, because I think it's one of the most important. as socialist Green New Deal activists locally, I think one of the most important things we can be doing is building solidarity with our trade unions. As labor activists, as climate activists, we should be working with and working through our trade unions because, and you know, the thing that really drives me is the understanding that climate change is a class issue. It's the global working class who are both most at risk from climate change, but also from the transition. And that's why we need trade unions, not just to be part of the fight for a Green New Deal, but to lead it, to lead the fight for a real economic transformation that puts the interests of working people at the forefront. And, you know, I think, to be honest about the situation, most trade unionists, I'm sure, will admit that many of our trade unions aren't quite where we need them to be, both in terms of politics and strategy in this issue. It obviously takes time to get, you know, to prepare for the realities of the climate crisis. And so it's down to us as rank and file activists, as trade union members, to work within our own unions, to organise our workplaces, to build confidence among our colleagues, and to agitate for our own unions to take militant action for a Green New Deal. And we do that by building power, building membership, and resisting the terrible anti-trade union laws that we face. So that's all I have to say. I want to thank you again for having me. And yeah, just to say, do follow Labour for Green New Deal's work. And if anyone is at a loose end of your climate activism, I just reiterate that call to really take up the struggle of working through your trade union.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was fantastic. And please do follow Labour for a Green New Deal on Facebook and on Twitter. The details have been put in the chat, so make sure you do that if you haven't done already. So I'm delighted to introduce one of our fantastic MPs, first elected in 2019. That's Nadia, who will be talking to us about this issue broadly, but also about the work she's been doing through her excellent climate education bill. Nadia.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be joining this discussion, and especially to be sharing a platform with so many brilliant comrades. I think that this discussion is extremely important post-COP to be talking about what the role of the Labour movement is, both parliamentary and also extra-parliamentary. Looking back at COP briefly then, COP and the government's net zero strategy is seriously disappointing. The commitments to reduce emissions just aren't strong enough. The Earth will reach 2.4 degrees C if all governments meet the 2030 targets, and 2.7 degrees C with the current policies. So we need far more ambitious pledges than the ones that we currently have. And while we still have the COP presidency, next year is going to be key. As people have said repeatedly, 1.5 has just about been kept alive, but it's on life support. COP failed to agree the loss and damage finance for countries that have disproportionately suffered as a result of the climate crisis. As Assad referred to earlier, a proposal for setting up a fund was submitted by all the 138 developing countries, which represent 5 billion people, and it was in the draft text, but it was then removed by the UK, the US, and the EU from the final text. No fund, just a workshop. So that just shows us that the rich don't want to pay for the damage that they've caused. They're happy for it to be passed on to working class people globally, but in particular in the global south. As well, the government's own net zero strategy fails to even provide the funding to reach net zero by 2050, which is the government's target, but as we know is dangerously unambitious and isn't enough. They're completely disinterested in ensuring a just transition. And I think one of the things that COP showed us is that a net zero strategy does not equal a Green New Deal. And the Tories fundamentally do not believe in the state-led investment that we need in public ownership, in sort of fundamental things that are important for a Green New Deal, like reversing all the anti-trade union laws. So we need to be fighting for a better alternative for our planet, for society, for workers. We need a socialist global Green New Deal that creates an irreversible shift in wealth and power from the billionaire polluters to people and to workers. That being said, COP did have some massive successes, and I think the biggest one was the movement and the mobilisations that were led by Indigenous activists. The fact that climate justice for the first time ever was central, and that we weren't just speaking about it, at least outside COP, in a tokenistic way, but it was interrogating the legacy of colonialism, the structural racism, the exploitation of people and planet that is perpetrated by the 1%. And since then, there have also been massive victories. For example, the Stop Cambo campaign has been successful in pausing the project. We still need to stop Cambo. Nicola Sturgeon has had to come out against Cambo. The pay to pollute case has gone to court, which has revealed the billions of pounds that the government is paying fossil fuel companies and oil giants in subsidies. I actually asked it was supposed to be Nadeem Zahawi, but it was he couldn't make it, so it was Alok Sharma's PPS instead at COP about Cambo, and whether the government would withdraw its support for Cambo and stop giving away billions in subsidies and tax breaks to polluters. And the answer I got, I think, highlights what an abject failure COP was on the inside. She said something like, "Oh, we won't always get it right, but we're all here in this room because we care about the environment, and we should all be supporting the government at this time." It was pretty ridiculous. But one of the movements that was particularly inspiring, I think, at COP was the youth climate movement, and that's what I'm going to speak a bit about today, because I've been working with youth climate strikers and activists since I was elected in 2019. I kind of see it as my responsibility as Parliament's youngest MP to be amplifying their voices in Parliament. And we've tabled together the Climate Education Bill, which Becky is also one of the co-sponsors of. It's got cross-party support, and it's also the first ever student-written bill that's come to Parliament. It's been written by school students at Teach the Future, who've been campaigning on this for a really long time. And the premise is basically that if our education system isn't preparing young people to mitigate and deal with the impacts of climate change, then it's failing them. And politicians often speak about 2050 as some faraway date, but for young people, for children who have just started school, who are 5 years old, 2050 isn't some faraway date. They're going to be 35 in 2050. I and people of my generation will still be of working age. So this bill would mean that climate change and sustainability is integrated throughout the curriculum like a golden thread, in primary schools, in secondary schools, in vocational training courses. So for example, not just learning about it in optional subjects like geography and triple science and in a very narrow way, but for example, people on plumbing courses being taught how to install low carbon heat pumps, children in food tech being taught about sustainable diets, learning about the history of colonialism and how it's so intertwined with the climate and ecological emergency in history lessons, sustainable economics in economics lessons and maths lessons. The other thing that it would do is decarbonise the education sector. So, for example, the buildings that children are learning in are retrofitted. I don't know how many people on this call were in lessons at school which were kind of like temporary kind of huts that never got retrofitted. I know I did. In fact, I had my geography lessons in them, which is kind of ironic. So that's a massive piece of legislation. It's literally making history, and that's coming back to Parliament at the end of the month. The other thing that I just wanted to briefly touch on is the Green New Deal bill, because this is something else that has been co-produced with the movement. And while the government is not doing nearly enough to decarbonise or to meet its commitments to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating, this piece of legislation sets out that path while also improving the lives for working class people. So it would create legally binding targets on emissions, on inequality, on environmental damage. It proposes massive investment in well-paid, unionised, sustainable jobs. It includes a comprehensive action plan to decarbonise our society, covers our energy supply, our transport system, farming, buildings, the way we work. And it would also stop fossil fuel extraction, so keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And crucially, it commits to reparations for the most affected communities, so communities in the so-called global south. Yeah, I'll stop there because I think I'm probably running out of time.
Thanks very much, Nadia. That was really useful. And it was such a great moment when we saw the climate education bill progressing again in Parliament. So fantastic. And to see in the gallery in Parliament the young people who'd worked with Nadia on this, really showing the way that the wider mass movements can work with progressive left MPs in Parliament to push forward a progressive transformative agenda on climate and so much else. Now, before we go to questions, I'm delighted to introduce the co-chair of Momentum, Gaya, who's going to be speaking about something very exciting, which is Momentum's Climate Justice Programme.
Thank you so much, Richard. And it's really great to be talking alongside such dedicated leaders on climate in our movement. Momentum's really happy to partner with the SCG on this policy seminar series, and I'm really pleased that we're starting with this important discussion. And I'm here today for a very short intervention to extend Momentum solidarity and support for advancing the vital agenda that comrades have outlined tonight, but also to tell you about a new climate justice programme that we're launching to support their work. So this moment after COP26 really feels like an important opportunity to kickstart our movement into deeper action on the climate crisis. We know that Socialists and the Labour Party care deeply about the climate crisis. In Momentum's policy primary last year, in the run-up to Labour Party conference, members voted on motions that they wanted to prioritise. 2 climate motions made it to the top 10, with the third most popular motion being one on global climate justice. Momentum has since been running climate-related events and supporting our members to get engaged in the COP26 actions last year, with Momentum groups participating in local COP26 Coalition organising. So the speakers here have outlined all the issues we have to grapple with and some of the strategies that we can use to build towards a Green New Deal. What we need to do is to equip our members with the skills and knowledge to really participate actively in pushing for this agenda. We as a movement need to be able to respond to the climate crisis as part of our work to build socialism on the ground. We know our movement is full of dedicated, talented organisers who have a lot to offer the climate movement. Our movement's track record and internationalism and analyses of power and system change are more important than ever. But to do this work, we need activists who understand the climate crisis and are able to engage with the climate movement, as well as bring climate justice to the other work that we do. It's absolutely critical that we build a sophisticated understanding of the nature of the crisis, a knowledge of concrete pathways to solving it, that we understand exactly where the barriers to us realizing those pathways to change lie and how to overcome them, to build a solid political analysis of the problems and solutions being proposed, to ensure that we ask for genuine policies and interventions, and that we're able to call out the policies masquerading as a Green New Deal, as Chris pointed out. And as we push for solutions that put the needs for the rights of communities and workers to be put first, we absolutely need to demand climate justice for the global south. And that is why Momentum is rolling out a political education program for our membership on climate justice. We'll be launching a syllabus in March this year that anyone can take part in. And we'll have a focus on helping participants understand the climate crisis, but also to examine and build the skills to actively help bring about the solutions needed, and how to be part of building that effective internationalist movement that Assad referred to. So just in this last hour, you've been exposed to lots of different ideas, thematic areas we should be working on, approaches we should be taking, legislation and political leaders we can campaign for, which is a lot to process, which is exactly why we want to help people break down key concepts, ideas, and demands, such as those that Asad, Becky, Chris, and Nadia just outlined. Through the Climate Justice Programme, we'll also work directly with our members on the ground to help them understand local and national opportunities to get involved and workshop ideas that they have for local climate organising. We'll look at strategies and tactics, from how to get involved in local campaigns to how to work effectively in coalition spaces, and how to support the important work of groups like the COP26 Coalition, Labour for a Green New Deal, and as well as initiatives from the SCG. The Climate Justice Programme will take a very participatory, interactive format with options to form study and discussion groups. And we are currently recruiting Momentum members to help design and deliver activities through a climate justice working group. So for members who have a bit of experience in climate and local organising, we'd love to hear from you and have you join us and build and deliver this important project. If you're interested in participating or learning more, whether in simply attending events that we organise, or if you want to get more involved in helping us design and deliver this programme, please fill out the form in the chat. You don't have to be a Momentum member to participate. Everyone is welcome. So a massive thanks again to all the people on this call who are doing the hard work to create a movement that is fit for purpose and to take on the climate crisis. And a big thanks to the SCG for initiating this series of seminars. It's our hope that we can help Momentum become an intelligent, well-informed and well-equipped part of the movement needed to build climate justice. So we look forward to engaging with you all as we work towards this together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gaia, and that's fantastic. It's great to see Momentum doing such crucial work on this and on so much else at the moment. Now, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I've been looking through all these excellent questions that have been put in the chat. I've merged a few as there are a lot of them, but I'm going to start off with a question for Asad, which is, shouldn't there be reparations for climate change caused by the richest nations, but which are affecting those least responsible for climate catastrophe? Asad.
So absolutely, look, the scale of just dealing with the climate impacts is already running into the hundreds of billions. But the reality, of course, is it's not simply about the climate crisis, right? It's the crisis of inequality. It's the fact that we've constructed a global economy that's been based on extraction of resources and exploitation of people, and that's fueled the capitalist expansion and industrial revolution in the global north, and it continues to do that. I saw a question about, tripling our aid. Look, tripling aid is a drop in the ocean. For every $1 waste given to the global south, $24 flows the other way in capital flows, in illicit flows, in unsustainable debt repayments. Fundamentally, of course, we need to have climate reparations to go to the global south. But the call from the global south is, yes, we need that, but much more importantly, we need you to stop extracting wealth and resources from us and allowing us the right to be able to develop our economies on sustainable economic development models. I mean, I think it's fitting that today, of course, is the anniversary, of the murder of Patrice Lumumba, right? The revolutionary leader of Congo, right? Who was overthrown by the US with the aid of the UK and Belgium because, like many leaders of the global south, Allende, Suharto, Mossadegh, Al-Benz, etc., we've seen when global south movements and governments try and take control of their economies, that they're overthrown. Now, there is much that we can look to around the world. particularly in places like Chile and Latin America, where we've seen a new wave of eco-socialism and governments coming in who are saying, you know, not only in the cradle of neoliberalism, but this is going to be the grave of neoliberalism. That requires not just these piecemeal individual policies about climate reparations. Fundamentally, what would be more impactful on the global south is fixing our trade policies, fixing the global financial taxation system, addressing and making liable our corporations for their impacts on the global south, economic, social, and environmental. So yes, we need to absolutely have more financial flows that go to the global south. I saw a question in there about how much money. Look, the UNCTAD estimates you need about 2.4 trillion each and every year for 10 years. Now, these sound like huge amounts of money, but when we put them into perspective, you know, we spent close to 17 trillion on bailing out the banks during the 2008 financial crisis. There is no shortage of money when it's needed. It's more about the quality of money, who it goes to, but fundamentally changing the economic system.
Thanks very much, Asad. And before I move on to the other questions we've got, I just want to make a quick announcement. The partnering organisation, our other partnering organisation, the Labour Assembly Against Austerity, is supporting a major event a week on Saturday. So that's the 29th of January. So we'll put the details in the chat, so please have a look. Now, so it's Saturday the 29th of January. It's called Johnson Out, Resist the Tory Offensive. And that event is looking to bring together voices from the front line of the resistance to the Tory attacks on our health, on our rights, on our jobs and our living standards. So get it in your diary, Saturday the 29th of January. I'm sure it'll be another fantastic Labour Assembly Against Austerity event that you can all take part in. Moving on to the other questions. There's a question here for Becky, a very good question. How do we win the Labour Party to backing public ownership, Becky?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I think it's about articulating sensible arguments, and I think all of us have got a duty to push the pragmatism of public ownership into the mainstream. So, for example, the argument that I gave earlier about other countries such as France and Germany already having examples of where public ownership of energy is working and how it brings bills down, that needs to be pushed out so that we convince more and more people. Because ultimately, what our members want to know is, one, if we push public ownership, is it going to, equate to cheaper bills for people within our community? So I think we've got enough evidence to be able to push that argument. The second thing they want to know is, how is public ownership of energy central to tackling the climate crisis? And the answer to that is simply that we've been waiting for the market to deliver for decades, and they haven't tackled the climate crisis or invested heavily enough in the infrastructure that we need to push forward the renewables agenda. And the only way that we can do that now at the pace that's required is to take things into public ownership. And we also need those new public energy companies to be the drivers of change, because we don't want things happening in a piecemeal way. We want them to be organised so that nobody gets left behind. And then the third and the most important question that our members want to know the answer to is, how are we going to pay for it? And this is really important that we explain that clearly, and explain that through taking over certain energy companies and water companies and other elements of public ownership that we might be looking at, we're actually acquiring profitable companies. So investment in public ownership would mean the acquisition of a profitable asset that generates an income stream for the future. And what we talked about at the last election, and I saw that so many MPs getting tied up in knots when they were asked the question about how you're going to pay for it. So of course there has to be compensation. That needs to be determined by Parliament. But in determining that, you don't just hand over the market value of the company at that present time. You look at whether those companies have actually been paying tax here in the UK, how much they've actually paid out in dividends since they were privatised, because the package that they're given has to be fair. And ultimately what you do in terms of paying for that is that you transfer shares into what are called government bonds. So there's nothing that would be paid by the UK taxpayer And then the interest that will be paid from those bonds, because the shareholders will get those bonds for a certain period of time and be entitled to a certain level of return, that would largely come out of the profits that will be generated by the new public companies. So we've got a plan to pay for it. We've got a plan for using those companies to tackle climate change and to invest in our grid infrastructure, into new generating capacity. And we've also got a plan and an argument surrounding bills and how all of our communities' bills would be lowered by public ownership. If we can get those three things clear across the movement, I think we can generate quite a lot of conversations within all of our CLPs. And ultimately, I think it's important to remember that when we're out in our communities and we're talking about public ownership, it's actually popular already. Most doorstep conversations will show that the person, whether they're actually a Tory voter or not, when they start delving into the arguments, they all want to have our own energy companies here in the UK. And most people get quite annoyed when they think that we've got other countries such as France who have public energy companies who are selling their energy to us here in the UK. But it's not good enough to have one in the UK. We can't do it ourselves. Other countries can do it. So there are so many ways that we can develop the argument. That was a long answer, that, Richard. Sorry, going off at the time.
Well, it was a good answer because it was informative, and also it didn't say, well, we're not going to manage that. So you set out a clear path for us to win that argument and organise for that. So that's really useful, Becky. Thanks. We've got a question here for Chris. It's a question on the role of banks in relation to climate justice. It said that banks are funding polluting sectors. What can be done about this?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely right. Banks are, and I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the role of fossil fuel companies, quite rightly, in driving and profiting from the climate crisis. But I like to think of, the fossil fuel industry as itself having pillars of support. So, one might be government, one might be a kind of cultural social license, legal regulations. But I think the financial system is a really huge pillar of support that the fossil fuel industry has. And when we think about, the high street banks that we see when we walk through our towns, Barclays, HSBC, these banks are financing fossil fuel extraction internationally to the tune of billions of pounds or dollars. And so there are lots of campaigns that are kind of going on at the moment for these banks to stop financing these fossil fuels. I guess, the situation is somewhat different in that, there's a very clear argument that you need to shut fossil fuel companies down because their kind of existential business model is to extract fossil fuels. And so that's why you need a just transition. With banks, it's slightly different. Financing fossil fuels isn't quite their core business. So there's at least some scope to kind of almost divorce those two fractions of capital. And there are campaigns for that. I've been involved in campaigns for Barclays to stop financing fossil fuels, as well as HSBC. As I said, Standard Chartered, another British-based bank, has been the subject of campaigns. But I think one of the things that I found really challenging when we were doing that campaigning is that, however, if we do, public campaigns or sit-ins or occupations, for me, it always felt like there was never quite enough that we could do to persuade banks to stop financing fossil fuels. Because ultimately, what we need to understand is that there's a real solidarity between the different elements of capital, so fossil capital, finance capital. And really what we need as part of a Green New Deal is a transformation through the state as part of broader socialist transformations. And so we need to either have some incredibly strict regulation on the financial system, which means that they're not allowed, any banks in this country aren't allowed to finance fossil fuel extraction, or more ideally, we'd be bringing these kind of key financial institutions again into the public sector so that we could use them to finance the elements of a Green New Deal that we need, expanding our services, expanding infrastructure, and not just speculating on with our planet as well as with our money. So it's a real big challenge, but I think as part of a Green New Deal, as part of a wholesale reorganization of the economy, the financial system would have to change dramatically as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. And now I've got a question for Nadia. It's a really good question. How do we tie together the struggle for climate justice and the women's struggle, given that women are the ones doing the unpaid work in the UK and picking up the slack where social care, the NHS and schools have failed? Have you got a perspective on that, Nadia?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and it kind of highlights the issue of the climate crisis, the crisis of inequality and low pay, of all of that being a class issue, but also a gendered issue. So, for example, we see it, don't we, as the person who asked the question, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, in social care, that it's disproportionately women, well, almost all women, but also disproportionately women of colour and migrant women. And that's just talking about paid social care, but there's also all of the unpaid labour. So I think when we speak about a Green New Deal, we're not just talking about jobs with hard hats when we're talking about investing in sustainable green jobs. We're also talking about things like, for example, social care, as Becky spoke about. I think not many people realise, but actually social care is 8 times more carbon intensive than the average job. Partly that's going to be because people are having to use their cars, partly because of single-use plastics. But yeah, it's no coincidence that those workers are also the lowest paid. And the whole point of a Green New Deal is that it's not just about decarbonising our society and the planet, it's also about democratising our society and giving people power, giving workers power in the workplace. So just one policy, which was, I believe, in the Labour for a Green New Deal motion to Labour Party conference, was to scrap all the anti-union laws. So since the 1980s, not just the latest 2015 Act. And that's important because that means that workers would be able to go on strike over climate obligations that their bosses aren't meeting, as well as industrial issues. And that's something that, yes, for all workers, their right to strike and workers' rights have been curbed, but particularly for the lowest paid workers, and those people are disproportionately women. And that's why the Sage Care Home workers who recently went on strike and won the real living wage, the London living wage, that's why that was so historic. It's because it never happens.
Thanks very much, Nadia. And so before we wrap up, I just want to come to each of our speakers for some closing comments. So if you could speak for up to a minute with your kind of final thoughts on what we need to do as a movement to win the campaign for climate justice. I'll start off with Assad and then go to Gaia. Assad?
So what can we do to win a radical eco-socialist global Green New Deal? I think first, we have to have a vision, right? I mean, and one of the things of neoliberalism we can say is it's taken away our imagination, and it's deliberately taken our imagination to believe that something is possible, an alternative is possible. So we have to believe an alternative is absolutely possible and be able to describe that world. We need the concrete political demands, and they need to be constituted on those 4 key things. Do we keep temperatures below 1.5 through fair share? That's 2030 targets for rich countries? Do we tackle global inequality and poverty, and so living wages, social protected public services? Do we ensure that we live within planetary limits? So we can't have a new wave of green colonialism to transform the global economies of the North. And do we undo those systems of injustice and oppression which have been hardwired into our system? Absolutely, we can. We know we can absolutely do it. Look, we have the technology to do it. We have enough. We can provide energy for 10 billion people. We know all of these things are possible. What is lacking is the political will, and that political will is directly correlated to the power of our movements. And that is most fundamentally the most important thing. We've got to talk about a radical global Green New Deal. We've got to build our movement. We've got to make our internationalism as part and parcel of our day-to-day operations, not as an add-on.
No, I think that's fundamentally correct. It's great to hear you advocate that so effectively, and hope as many people as possible hear your message, listen to it and act upon it in our movements. Gaia, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot has been said already, but just to add to, Assad sort of outlined what we need in order to make this happen, and we're fighting for our futures here. And I think that's why we need to really dig into what we need to do in this moment and really step back and think about that. And I think when I'm thinking about from our own movement's perspective, I think it's time for us to evolve as a movement. We've done things in a certain way for decades, and now we have to like learn to adapt to these new challenges that we're facing. And I think one of the key things that will make or break whether we're able to do this is, will we be able to work in coalition with other groups and other agendas, and how will we be able to join the forces of all these different strands of movements that have like overlapping agendas and overlapping demands, and how can we work together effectively, intelligently, generously, and compassionately together to deliver what we need right now. And I think another thing is that we need to reignite our history of internationalism. I think it's fallen by the wayside. We talk about it a lot, but we don't really know how to practice it anymore. And I think that's going to be critical. And I think especially as activists and as movements in the global north, we have an extra responsibility, because we have more power than people in the global south politically. We're closer to power, even though we may not recognize it. We are, and we need to step into our power, recognize it, and demand these things from our leaders and unseat the leaders that don't give in to these demands. And I think it's a huge responsibility for us, but we can do it together.
Thanks so much. And now some final thoughts from Chris from Labour for a Green New Deal.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'll be brief. I mean, just to reiterate what other speakers have said, if we're to win a transformative socialist Green New Deal, it needs to be on the back of a powerful movement. So that means building power in the Labour Party, but also building power in our trade unions and building power in our social movements that are capable of mobilising in the streets. And we must remain uncompromising in the boldness and the transformational nature of our vision, because anything short of that just won't be enough. Thanks, everyone. Solidarity.
Thanks so much, Chris. And a big thank you again to all you and Labour for a Green New Deal really encouraging MPs to take up this fight and really done such a great job in popularising the need for a real transformative socialist Green New Deal. And finally, I'd like to go to Becky for your final thoughts on the campaign for climate justice and a Green New Deal.
Thanks. Well, I think we just need to remember why it is we're all here. And I think we're all fighting to tackle climate change, but more than that, we're all part of this movement because we want people to have a nice life. We want them to feel secure. We want them to have enough money to live on so that they can do exciting things in their leisure time. We want that quality of life for everyone, whether it's here in the UK or whether it's across the world. So we need to make sure that we develop our arguments in a way that don't just speak to the movement. They speak to Dave in Salford, they speak to Mark in Milton Keynes, they speak to Tina in Tyneside, and they tell them that if you want to be part of this movement, if you want to sign up to a Green New Deal, the one that we're offering, you'll have more money in your pockets, you'll feel more secure because your job will be secure and well paid, you'll get a decent home that'll be insulated to the highest standard with the highest, most up-to-date technology in terms of heating and other green technologies, and you'll be able to enjoy your life because that's what this Green New Deal is about, and it will offer your children and your grandchildren a job, a decent home, and that dream of actually having a future and having an economy that works for them instead of constantly working for the economy. I think if we can get that argument right, who wouldn't be in support of the Green New Deal? So we're halfway there. We've just got to make sure that more people outside our movement hear what we're trying to say.
Thanks so much, Becky, and a big thank you to all our speakers tonight, to Asad, to Gaia, to Nadia, to Becky, and of course to Chris. But a big thank you also for everyone who registered for this event, for everyone who has logged into Zoom, and for everyone who's watched it on other platforms. Big thank you to Momentum, big thank you to Labour Assembly Against Austerity, and remember their event on Saturday 29th of January. And it's really good to come together for these monthly seminars, which as the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs, we're doing in addition to the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs roadshows, which have been postponed for a brief period. We had some great ones in December, but the ones in person, out and about around the country, have been postponed for a short while because of the Omicron wave recently, but they will resume, coming to a town, village or city near you. And it's fantastic the interest we've had in it. In fact, we got over 180 offers to put on and to host Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs roadshow meetings in people's communities, which just goes to show that the Labour left, which was there at the founding of the Labour Party by Keir Hardie and others, is alive and well, and the proclamations of its demise or withering away are somewhat exaggerated. We're here, we're still fighting, and when we think of what we've heard from Assad, Chris and others about the climate catastrophe that's on the way, never has it been more accurate to say that truly there is a world to win, a world to win. I just want to draw your attention to the next two monthly online policy seminars that the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs is hosting. I hope you can join us for those as well. The next one in February, that's Monday the 21st of February, is for a national care service and ending NHS privatisation. And then our March policy seminar online is tax justice, the case for a wealth tax. So I really hope that all of you can join us for that as well. There's so much going on. As a movement, we're fighting back. A few of us have just actually come to this online seminar from an inspiring protest outside the House of Lords against the Tories' draconian anti-protest bill. So let's carry on building, let's carry on supporting each other, and let's really make sure that 2022 isn't a year of despondency and defeat, but is a year of victories. Victories for the movement, victories for the 99%, and victories for all on this call who believe in a better, fairer, and more just society and world. Good night. Thanks so much for joining us.